Okay, so now we are officially beginning the content of the course. We're beginning with the first chapter of the textbook. This is it here, The Elements of Moral Philosophy by James Rachels, 8th edition. Alright, so since this is the first week, there's not a lot of reading material. There's just this one chapter. It's a very short chapter. It's about 14 pages. Okay, so this chapter, what the author Rachels does is essentially there's basically just 3 different examples, case studies, you might call them. And what Rachels does is give us several reasons why we might think one thing about the case study and reasons why we might think another thing about the case study. And then at the end, what Rachels does is he gives us what he calls a minimum conception of morality. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. So we'll run through these case studies real quick and look at some of the arguments he proposes to give us. So the first example is baby Teresa. So baby Teresa was born without a brain, essentially. She was born in Florida in 1992. She did not have the top part of her brain, I guess, more appropriately. So without the bottom part of your brain, your heart won't beat and all that stuff. So she had the bottom part of her brain, which was keeping her heart beating and her lungs respirating. But there was no higher cognitive functions besides that. Okay, so what the parents wanted to do in this case is the parents wanted to donate the child's organs to charity. Or not charity, sorry. They wanted to donate them, well, I guess a kind of charity. They wanted to donate them to save the lives of other babies that could use the organs. Now, to do that, what would have to happen is they would have to essentially, quote unquote, kill the, baby Teresa to harvest her organs. If they would have let her die of natural causes, the organs would deteriorate. So death usually takes some period of time. Organs would deteriorate. They would probably not be usable for transplant. So what happened is let's see. I think what happened, sorry. Okay, so it was illegal to do that, so the parents weren't allowed to do that. Florida law prohibited it. Baby Teresa did die, and her organs were not useful for transplant because they deteriorated. So there's the legal question, and obviously it's illegal. So in this class, one thing to know is we're not going to be focused so much on the law because we don't really care that much about it. We're interested in thinking about whether something is right or wrong, regardless of whether it's legal or illegal, right? Because laws can be wrong. So up until a certain point in time, not that long ago, slavery was entirely legal in the United States. But the question is it morally permissible? Up until very recently, schools were segregated, women didn't have the right to vote, people of same sex couldn't get married. So all kinds of things were illegal. Doesn't mean that they were morally wrong. And maybe there's lots of things that are currently legal now, like that are morally wrong. Like we'll be talking about the death penalty later, or things that are illegal now, like drugs or marijuana, but that should be illegal. So we'll be talking. So we don't really care whether it's legal or not. That's not particularly interesting. We want to know, would it have been morally appropriate for her parents to donate her organs? Okay, so the arguments that Rachels gives us is that he gives us in this section a benefits argument, that we could benefit a lot of people by doing that. And once we get to our moral theories later, you'll see that's a kind of utilitarian argument. So one way of thinking about moral issues is in terms of harm or preventing harm or doing good. So one way of thinking about this issue is we can benefit a lot of people and we wouldn't have harmed anyone by donating Teresa's organs. The other two types of arguments Rachels gives us, and these are both what you might call Kantian arguments when we do our moral theory later. One is that we should not use people as a means to an end. So that's the way Kant talked about morality. He said anytime we use another person as a means to an end rather than respecting them as an end in themselves, that we do something wrong morally. and the other is a kind of Kantian argument, or similar to Kant's argument, that it's just always wrong to kill. So one thing to think about, okay, so we'll run through the other examples real quick. Second example was of Jody and Mary. So Jody and Mary were twins that were conjoined. Now, the problem for Jody and Mary is that Jody and Mary, they were sharing the same organs. So there were two heads, two brains, but there was only one set of organs. Okay, so Jody was the one who kind of had the organs in her body, and Mary had kind of like a head sticking off to the side. All right, so the doctor said, look, if we don't remove Mary from Jody, i.e. cut off the head essentially, then they're both going to die. So what is the right thing to do? Would it be to let them live their natural life and they both die at some point, or would it be to essentially remove Mary and kill Jody? And to save Jody. The parents were Catholics. They opposed this on the grounds it would hasten Mary's death. We believe nature should take its course, etc. It says here the hospital, hoping to save Jody, petitioned the court for permission to perform the operation. Courts agreed. As expected, Jody lived, Mary died. Okay, so again, there's legal issues. Does the state have a right to do that? Totally separate issue. Interesting, separate. Again, is it legal? Should it be legal to do that? Separate question. We're just thinking about the morality of removing Mary from Jody such that Mary dies and Jody lives. So we get another version of the benefits argument. He calls this the argument to save as many as we can, and another kind of Kantian argument, the argument from the sanctity of human life. So one thing you might be noticing is that these utilitarianism and Kantian ethics are two sort of fundamentally different ways of thinking about ethics. We'll see that as we get to our ethical theories. One focuses on the consequences of the action, one focuses on the rule. So Kantian ethics is a kind of rule-based approach to ethics, where utilitarianism doesn't really care about rules, it just thinks about the consequences of actions and having as good of consequences as possible. So there are some interesting differences between the first example and the second example. And most people feel more comfortable with saying it would have been okay for the parents to donate Tracy's organs, but they feel less comfortable saying it's okay for the parents to remove Mary or to kill Mary or let her die or whatever, however you want to think about that. And interestingly, the way you think about things can make a big difference the way you describe them. So first off, why is it that people tend to feel differently about these two cases? I'll suggest one reason, and this will be something that will play a role in a lot of issues. Question is, a very fundamental question of ethics is who deserves moral treatment and in virtue of what? So moral treatment is usually reserved for entities called persons. Now, in philosophy, a person isn't limited to a human being, like you or I. Some people think that animals can be persons, or some types of animals can be persons. And also, a lot of philosophers have argued that some people with human DNA are not persons. So, most notably, fetuses. That would be relevant when we talk about abortion, but it's relevant here in the case of Tracy. The question is she a person? Does she have rights? So, if you're a person, you have certain rights. Is Tracy actually a person? Well, there's good reason to think that maybe Tracy isn't a person, right? Well, put it this way, if there's any human being, any genetically human being that's not a person, Tracy would seem to be a very good candidate because she has literally no brainwave activity. So you might think that when we kill Tracy, when we terminate that life, we're not killing a person, we're not violating anyone's rights, whereas in the case of Jody and Mary, there's a much stronger argument to be made that they're both persons because they both have fully functioning brains. Now, some philosophers have argued that people don't become persons until later, until their cognitive functions develop, but there's a much more intuitive sense in which Jody and Mary are both persons, and to kill one of them violates their rights. Although how we describe the Jody and Mary case could make a big difference. So one way of thinking about the Jody and Mary case is that you could think about it in terms of the body being Jody's, and that Mary is kind of attacking Mary. So Jody. So to kill Mary, maybe in this case, is not to violate her right, because usually if someone comes to kill you, they lose their right. So if I come to kill you, for example, you can defend yourself and kill me. So maybe that's the case when we kill Mary, because her continued existence is a threat to Jody's life. Maybe it's kind of justified killing, because it's killing in self-defense. So there's a lot of different ways you might think about that case. But one obvious difference between the first and the second is that Tracy seems to be not a person, whereas Jody and Mary are persons, and that will be an interesting topic that will kind of run through the whole course: is who is a person, what criteria does someone become a person, what rights do persons have, things like that. Under what circumstances do they have those rights, etc. All right, the third example, Tracy Latimer. Tracy was 12 years old. She had an extreme case of cerebral palsy. She was 12, but she only weighed 40 pounds. And doctors described her as functioning at the mental level of a 3-month-old baby. So what happened here was her father, Robert, decided to terminate Tracy's life. So Tracy was also up for having another operation. She had had a lot of operations already to keep her alive, and she was up for having another one. So what Robert decided to do is he essentially killed her. He put her in a truck and piped carbon monoxide into the truck, and she died. The mother came home. She said that she was relieved to see what had happened. Again, we don't care too much about the laws, but somewhat interesting, I guess. Robert, the father, was tried for murder. The judge didn't give him the mandatory 10-year sentence. He gave him 1 year in prison. But the Supreme Court of Canada actually ruled that the mandatory sentence had to be imposed, and Robert Latimer entered prison in 2001 and was released in 2009 on parole. All right, so what should we think morally about this? Did Robert do something wrong? Maybe he did something right. Maybe the right thing to do was to prevent that suffering. So again, we could think about the previous types of arguments that we got in the other cases, like benefits argument. So obviously Robert is reducing Tracy's suffering. He's also reducing the suffering of the family as well. But then there's the idea that people have rights, and if Tracy had a right to life, then Robert violated that right, and it was wrong. So again, the question of personhood comes up. Now, clearly, baby Teresa wasn't a person if personhood is dependent at all on mental capacity. Tracy had a little bit more mental capacity, but not much more if we're to trust the scientific evidence of that. A couple other arguments that are given here. One is the argument from wrongness of discriminating against a handicap. So, did Robert discriminate? Did he kill her just because she was handicapped? So racism and sexism are wrong. They're defined as arbitrary discrimination. So we're going to talk about a couple essays related to discrimination later. One on speciesism, as well as one on affirmative action. Another interesting one that's probably worth talking about. Rachel's mentions the slippery slope argument. So that's something you hear commonly when people are arguing about something. Well, if we allow this, then this will happen, and then this will happen, and everything will go to hell or whatever. Slippery slope arguments are a form of bad reasoning. They are logical fallacy, because there's no guarantee that all these chain of events is going to happen when people say that the way that people say they're going to happen. So usually it's just a kind of scare tactic. There's no proof. Now, if you have evidence, really good evidence, but a lot of times, usually in the case of slippery slope argument, people just state that something is going to happen from something, and this is going to lead to that and that and that, and it's all going to be really bad without really knowing what the actual consequences are going to be. All right. So, what we're supposed to learn from this chapter is that morality is about providing reasons. It's about thinking about examples, thinking about cases, thinking about what we should do, and trying to provide the best reasons we can for our decision. That's essentially what moral philosophy is, but oftentimes carried out at a high level of abstraction. Rachel's has a nice statement of what he calls the minimum conception of morality. He says, section 1.6, we may now state the minimum conception. Morality is at the very least the effort to guide one's conduct by reason. That is, to do what there are the best reasons for doing while giving equal weight to the interests of each individual affected by one's action. So some of the key ideas here is that morality is about guiding one's conduct by reason. So that's the philosophical conception of what morality is. It's not about what society says we should do, or religion, or culture, or your parents, or what you feel like doing, or what's best for you. It's about trying to provide the best reasons for doing a particular action. And part of the idea of guiding one's conduct by reason is the idea of being impartial. That is, considering the interests of everyone involved, right? So reason, the idea here is that the perspective of reason, or when we try and think rationally about something, what we're doing is we are taking a perspective that considers everyone's interests. It's not my subjective view on a particular topic. It's an objective view, right? And that's the perspective. It's supposed to be the perspective of reason. So that's, as you'll see, all the various conceptions of ethics we're going to talk about in the next few weeks. They are subjective rather than objective, or moral philosophy strives to take an objective perspective on moral issues and think about objectively, rationally, what the right thing to do is, and what that means in practice is considering everyone's interests equally. All right, that concludes our sort of reading for this week, and next week we'll get started looking at some common conceptions of morality, religion, and culture that philosophers have generally found to be not the right way of thinking about what morality is. So part of the next few weeks is we'll come back to this idea of objective morality by considering various subjective or relative conceptions of morality and seeing why they don't work as useful theories of morality.